Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this first Getting the Best of Pest Green Series webinar for 2022. It's a beautiful day, and we have wonderful speakers lined up for you. The first speaker is Dr. Jason Gordon, who is an assistant professor of community forestry at the University of Georgia. He teaches community forest management, arboriculture, the professional internship course, as well as a summer field course. He holds degrees in natural resource management from University of Georgia and Penn State University. Welcome, Jason. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Panisi. It's good to be here. Welcome, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right. Is that good, buddy?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I apologize for the way this screen looks. We've been with the webinar team for over a half an hour now, trying to figure out how to work with my brand new monitors that I got this week. And it's not as easy as you would think to figure out how Zoom does share presentations among different kinds of monitors. So we're going to have to go with this one. So just bear with me. Anyway, I was asked to talk about tree pruning, and it's my understanding that this audience generally tends to be fairly mixed with different levels of knowledge. And so my thought was to provide you with a good overview of tree pruning and the types of pruning and pruning systems and so forth. And I will start off right off the bat that I'll have some resources that I'll share with you so that you can learn more. But really some of the most in-depth and I guess best put together, best produced information that gets into details that the scary details of pruning comes from, of course, University of Georgia has a lot of information if you go to UGA Extension. And then also another good one is University of Florida. And some of you may have heard of Dr. Al Gilman, who's retired University of Florida tree guru. And so you can go to his website and find a bunch of information as well. So this presentation and tree pruning in general is driven by two standards. And this is very important to know. Pruning is not something that is just a random type of process. There is a procedure, standards that arborists use in order to properly treat the tree and arrive to that ultimate goal, which is an aesthetically pleasing tree, but also a tree that is safe for the owner and for people near that tree to prevent tree failure. And so these standards are ANSI A300. That's the pruning. The pruning standards does not relate to root pruning, which is a whole different monster by itself. And then we always talk about the ANSI Z133, which is the safety standards that we follow as well. All right, so we can't talk about tree pruning without kind of have a little bit of an overview of the biology of trees, of branches, and the biology of pruning. So I just want to quickly cover this for you as a review for some of you, but oftentimes we forget about this, and I think we see that oftentimes when we're out in the field and we see some of the really unfortunate pruning practices that take place out there. All right. So the first thing I want you to remember is that trees are modular and they're autonomous. What this means is that they're basically like Lincoln logs. All right. Each part fits into the next part and operates separately from the rest of the tree. So think about it like each twig, like a Lincoln log, fits into the next largest branchlet like a joint. And then each branchlet fits into a branch and so on all the way to the stem. Now, each leaf on those branchlets makes the food through photosynthesis, right? Go back to your old biology classes. Before sharing that food, those carbohydrates, that energy with the rest of the tree, the leaf feeds its own twig first and its own branchlet first and so on. It takes care of itself first. The ends of the Lincoln logs are called nodes. Okay. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but I'm circling the node at the middle of this graphic on the left. And then in between those nodes are internodes. Okay. And this is really important for you to know when we're talking about pruning, because we want to prune at the node. If you prune at the internode, that will severely injure the tree as a whole and effectively, over the long run, make that tree weak. All right. Now we know that as a hitting cut. We've seen that as topping, like we see with crepe myrtle quite often. Crepe myrtle can withstand it a little bit better. It's a different type of species, and that species matters. But there's other types of trees, like oaks, for example, that really have a tough time when it's cut at the internode. So in pruning, we want to manipulate where hormones go. And if we want to, say, slow or reduce the growth of that tree, which is oftentimes what we want to do with pruning, then we want to prune off the terminal bud, this end bud at the apical meristem, because hormones are driven there and basically tell the tree, okay, let's grow taller. All right. If we cut that off, the hormones don't get to that terminal bud and they go to the other axillary buds and other places of the tree. And that slows that or suppresses that part of the tree. So I want to remind you about branch connections here, okay? Because this is just really critical. This graphic shows the protection zones of branches. I'm circling it. And this area of the confluence of the stem and the branch. Okay. Here at the top, you see this this little ridge, this bump at the top between the stem and the branch. That's called the branch bark ridge. And underneath that is the branch collar. These are very sensitive parts of the tree. The goal of pruning is to cut just outside of that area. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But we want to cut just outside of that branch bark ridge and branch collar to leave the branch protection zone unharmed. Why is that? Because we'll see in a moment, this is where the tree is able to heal itself, okay? Seal itself, excuse me. Trees do not heal like we do. They seal over the wounds to prevent or to mitigate the likelihood that fungi, and other things and pests will get in there and start to damage the tree and cause decay and so forth. And if it's cut in the right place, which is where this red dotted line is at, then that allows the natural processes take place where it starts to compartmentalize over that wound, seal over that wound, and protect itself. Trees can't run like animals can, so it has to seal over. And that'll help hopefully keep the tree healthy enough. And that's one of the reasons why we prune at the nodes. What you see here is a node, and we do not prune at the internodes. This would be the internode where my cursor is at here, and that would be a bad place to prune. It doesn't have those sealing capabilities that I talked about. All right, so I mentioned this word compartmentalization. With compartmentalization or coded compartmentalization of decay in trees, trees seal over the wounded area to basically box in that decay, the fungus that can get in there and cause decay. So the right kind of pruning allows trees to compartmentalize. The wrong kind of pruning opens that wound to fungus and borers and other problems, as I said. Now, if you look at photo 1, that's a longitudinal closure that resulted from a flush cut. Okay, so it was too close. We go back to this one. It was cut too close to the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. And this is the sealing, basically the closure that resulted from it. And it's kind of a longitudinal type of closure. Photo 2 is the better type of closure that we want to see. We see a roll of new bark. We see closure to a point. Now, photo 3 is where we see a stub that was left. And again, that was pruned too far away from the branch color, the cut line. And so ideally what we want to do is go back. When we come back to that tree, we would want to make a correction on that and prune off that stub. That would be one of the first things we would do on a return visit to that tree. So you got to look at past cuts to estimate that individual tree's ability for strong compartmentalization of response. And there are certain species that respond better than other species. In fact, oaks are a mixed bag. You have some oaks that respond well, other oaks that don't respond so well. There are negative effects of pruning. That's why we talk so much about knowing what your objective is, having a prescription for pruning, because pruning you're cutting off part of this biological organism, right? And so you're cutting off the ability of that tree to produce energy. And in other words, it reduces the photosynthetic capacity of that tree. And that in turn, the more of the leaf area is removed, the tree has less chlorophyll for photosynthesis to take place. It in turn reduces overall growth for a time. It affects resistance to pathogens and insects. And it makes an open wound. So it's a site for pathogens to enter into that wounded area. Heartwood could be exposed if pruning is not done correctly. If there's too much of a cut too far into the tree, into the stem. And of course, insects are attracted to fresh pruning cuts, and then therefore can either cause damage themselves or transmit a pathogen as well into that tree. Large scale pruning of large limbs or heavy dosage pruning can reduce that overall energy that's available for the tree to defend itself. In other words, it doesn't compartmentalize as well. Or the other thing is that because it's compartmentalized, that uses energy reserves as well. And then finally, as you see in this photo here, pruning, particularly over pruning, not done right, can lead to invigoration of shoots in unpruned areas as the tree responds in a negative way to this highly invasive procedure. This tree right here is an oak tree that I found in a neighborhood. And obviously it was topped all over the place. And this is what you're back, all these sprouts. And so there's a loss of energy reserves with a lot of energy used in healing that wound and basically trying to survive that invasive procedure. So it's so important to do the right kind of pruning. Now, overall, and we've seen studies of this, that it's so much better to do pruning on a tree than to do nothing at all. Okay. The tree will become more vigorous and will have a healthier life and better condition with the pruning than if you leave it alone. And we oftentimes need to do a little bit more pruning or dosage even, than what we're often used to doing. Ed Gilman actually has a paper on that. All right. So we move on. If I can. All right. So let's talk about pruning objectives. And this comes from the ANSI A300. And again, that's a book that you can purchase. I don't want to, basically, this is a flow chart of a way to think about the pruning process. Important to first carefully consider why we're pruning. Dr. Alex Shigo, who did a lot of the research on compartmentalization, said pruning is one of the best things that we can do for a tree, but it can also be one of the worst things, as I mentioned, with those negative impacts. So it's important to consider your objectives. Identify those reasons. Why are you pruning? Is it for storm damage? Is it homeowner needs aesthetics? Has it never been pruned? Improve the structure? Is it a young tree? Do we want to improve the structure from the beginning of its life? Second, we want to define those objectives, and this involves examining the tree, examining the site, and combining that with why the owner or the manager wants to do the pruning. The objectives need to take into account several considerations, which I'll talk about in the next slide, including species, as I've mentioned, the age of the tree, because mature trees have a tougher time recovering from pruning, to certain types of pruning than other aged trees. Then you decide what kind of pruning system do you want to use, which we'll talk about. Usually what we're talking about here in Georgia, at least, is a natural pruning system. And then we consider the amount that we're going to prune, the dosage, in other words, what type of cuts, what's the limit of the cut size that we're going to implement, and the pruning cycle, the interval. How often are we going to get out? Are we doing a contractual pruning with the city, where we might just get out every 5 years, or are we in a situation where we can come out to a homeowner about once a year or once every 2 years to do that structural pruning process, for example? And so we write the specifications, write it down and show an example of that. And then we prune it. We actually do it. And then we go back and review and inspect the work, and we monitor it for follow-up, any kind of follow-up treatment as well. So this is the process of planning and implementation to think about. So here's some reasons for pruning. First of all, obviously, the most common reason, accommodate human needs, which could be, for example, clearance or taking care of a hazard. And I would say to a large extent are the most frequent reasons for pruning, or one of the most frequent reasons for pruning is probably dealing with hazards or risk mitigation. This photo that you see here is an actual photo that I took in a particular university town. I would say that only university students could come up with something that creative. Other reasons for pruning: improving form and structure, removing dead branches and crossing branches, encouraging fruiting and flowering aesthetics. When you talk about, don't talk to me about fruit trees, that's a whole other world by itself, as far as how to effectively do that to produce fruit, at least particularly like on a commercial basis. Manage for wildlife habitat, which is part of encouraging fruiting and habitat. Promoting growth in a certain desired direction, directional pruning away from a building, for example. Reducing risk and making corrective or preventative measures, increasing light and air penetration, so that that tree is not like a wind sail. When wind comes through, it's one of the biggest issues we have to deal with is wind in trees. Is every time we have a storm, there might be health issues like mistletoe, which requires pruning off a branch, and not just the mistletoe itself. So there's a number of different reasons why we would prune, and the ANSI A300 goes through that. Other important considerations is the tree biology, such as the growth rate, and this is all related to species. Growth rate, the growth habit, the size and the form. Is it excurrent or decurrent tree? In other words, does it spread or does it grow like a pine tree? The reaction to pruning, how good of a compartmentalizer that particular species is. Wood strength, something like water oak, which tends to be a much more brittle wood than other types of oaks. The likelihood of failure, for example. You got to think about the physical location of the tree, the history and habitat, the species range of the site. When you're thinking comparing pruning an oak, Georgia versus pruning an oak in Minnesota, we've got different, we've got a hot, humid environment or climate in Georgia versus a cold climate up in Minnesota. And so the response is going to be different. The ability of that tree to bounce back after that invasive procedure is going to be a little bit different in different places, different ranges. Location on the landscape, the wind patterns. One of the biggest issues, again, is the wind direction, how that tree catches the wind. And trees grow towards the direction of least resistance. And so that's something we want to take into account as we're pruning out those branches. Pruning system and type, what kind of shape we want, what kind of desired views we want. Again, the minimum maximum branch size that we will allow to be cut based on the ability of that tree to respond, and the location and branches of the wound. Think about opposite versus alternate branching. That's part of the form of the tree as well. Selecting a primary leader, noting the dominant top branch and selecting which top branch is more dominant. That's the one we want to encourage to grow, and we want to suppress the other one that's competing, because otherwise these will compete and they'll become two dominant stems. That is not good for the tree and causes higher risk of failure. And then think about the dosage. How much are we actually going to cut off? And I'll give you some rules of thumb for that in a minute. This is what the pruning specification might look like. Pruning objective. So we start with the objective. Like I said, pruning objective is to control and maintain the size of the subject tree. Then we have some measurable numbers here. Reduction cuts will be made on branches 1.5 inches and larger in diameter. Maintain the tree's height at X feet So you see that it's fairly specific in what we are aiming to do with our particular activity. The pruning system is to be used as a natural system. I'll tell you about what that is in a minute. And the intent is to form a typical subject species, something like we would tend to see in the woods, if you will, spreading branch system, a wide branch system. All right, pruning systems. And I'm going to fly through a number of these because it is unlikely you will ever practice them unless maybe you work in a botanical gardens or something like that. But in other parts of the world, something like pollarding is very common in Europe specifically. It basically begins with young trees and their heading cuts. As if you remember a few slides ago, I said never ever do heading cuts. But there's heading cuts that, if done correctly, is not, if it's done over and over in frequent heading cuts, it's actually not so bad for the tree. And each subsequent year, all those sprouts that are a reaction to those cuts are cut back to the original cut, where a swelling starts to occur. And you can see that in these trees here. And this is called a pollard head that forms. But it has to be consistent. You have to have consistent removal in order to the origin, in order for the tree to remain healthy. So it does take quite a bit of effort. Obviously, there's topiary training to a shape. Espalier, this is great. You see this occasionally. Some of the most amazing espalier that I've seen, besides the botanical gardens, was at the Bartlett lab up in North Carolina, where they were experimenting and have done some really interesting things with different types. You can do this with fruit trees. It's often done with, I've seen it with southern magnolia, elm. It's just pretty amazing. You can do it with many different types of species. And then there's these pleaching, which is basically a technique of interweaving, leaving a dead branches to make a hedge, as you can see in this picture. Trees are planted in lines. Again, this is the kind of thing you'll see more in Europe. But what we do here goes within the system of natural pruning. So those are all the systems. Those are all outlined in the standards, in the ANSI standards. What we do here is natural pruning by 99% of the time. And natural pruning, the reason it's called natural pruning is because I guess you could say the goal of it is to eventually um, uh, reach or mimic the characteristic growth patterns of that particular tree. What is this tree here in this picture, do you think? I think with anything about trees, I think you look at it and say a good guess would be an oak tree, which in fact it isn't, because we're used to seeing an oak tree in that form. There's different types of activities for natural pruning: crown reduction, raising crowns, improving structure, and risk reduction. And I believe I go through those. Crown reduction basically makes the crown smaller. Raising crowns raises up for clearance. Improving structure is just, like it says, makes that tree stronger. And then risk reduction also makes the tree stronger and decreases parts of the tree that may lead to failure in the future. So I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I basically want you to be aware and appreciate of the various varied crown shapes that we have when we talk about natural. And it's also important to remember that when a tree grows out in an open space like a park and does not have competition, you're going to get a bit of a different shape than when it's in the woods. And of course, these trees evolved in dense woodlands where they had to compete, right? And so they would tend to have a bit of a more thinner or a less wide, kind of less spreading kind of shape in a woodland than if they were out in an open area where they might have more extended limbs and a more spreading type of shape. But just take a look here. Starting at the left, you have bicurrent, you have excurrent, you see the adcurrent, adcurrent. The main ones that we deal with are in horticulture are excurrent and decurrent. Okay, excurrent would be like a pine tree, a Christmas tree. whereas D current is that spreading shape of sand oak tree. And then on the far right, you see some other types of shape that all fall into the X current, D current, bi current, etc. categories. All right, the ideal crown to tree proportion is about 66, 67% in order to make a strong tree. So in other words, you want about a 2/3 live crown ratio. You might see that in the literature as LCR, 66%. In other words, you want up to where this line is at as stem, and then you want more live crown height, the fuller crown compared with the amount of stem that you have. All right. And what that does, that's important, is because that allows that tree to continue to produce for production of energy. And as well, I don't want to get into this in depth, but it allows it to absorb wind energy without becoming a lever, if you will, which makes that tree weak during a storm. Again, storm damage is one of the biggest things we have to always think about. So the point is that keep that crown to stem ratio at about 66% when you're thinking about dosage. All right, so talk about how to prune here. Again, so here, what we have here is depending on the size and the weight of the branch, you would either use a 1-cut or a 3-cut pruning process or method. This graphic here shows where you should and should not prune to protect the branch defensive zone. And I'll get into more detail here, but this is the first overall picture. And yes, when you're cutting off a branch like this, you would cut it just outside of the branch collar and the ridge. And then you see another yes here. If you're cutting down the stem or suppressing that part of the tree, you do not want to cut again in the internode. So you notice these two yeses and this yes up here at the end of that branch are both at the nodes, and the nodes are in the internodes. All right. So like I said, you use the 1-cut method or the 3-cut method. The 1-cut method are for smaller branches, usually about less than 3 inches diameter. The 3-cut method, which many of you are probably aware of, you first make a notch underneath away from where the confluence of the branch and the stem. You cut off all the weight next of that branch, and then you finally clean it all up by the number 3 here, where you finish cutting off that stump. And that's what'll help to make that nice compartmentalization that we see in this middle picture. Now, this isn't always practical. If you've got 100 trees to do on a contract pruning, you might not be able to do a 3-cut method on each one. So what do? You have to figure out a way to hold that branch and support the weight of that branch as you do a single cut with a nice sharp handsaw, for example. And because the main thing you want to avoid is that peeling, where that branch would peel back the bark and potentially cambium of that stem if you're pruning back a branch. And you'll notice here on the left by this graphic from Dr. Coder that the overall objective is to avoid getting into that defensive zone that I talked about before at all costs. Right. So from this graphic here, where we had these two yeses correspond to two different types of cuts. The first cut is a reduction cut that you see here. A reduction cut removes a stem back to a lateral branch, and that lateral branch needs to be about a third of the diameter of the pruned branch. Okay. And this forces that lateral branch to become more dominant. So basically you're telling that tree, all right, quit growing here. We want you to refocus your energy on growing this other branch because we want you to stop growing so fast or going in the wrong direction. So it makes that lateral branch become more dominant. If you want it, and you obviously want to cut from the outside, where it says 3rd cut, you want to cut from the outside of the stem. into the direction of that crotch. And then you have removal cut, which is where another one of those yeses was in the previous slide. And this is simply where it's a cut that removes it. As you can see here, you remove a branch back to the original stem. On larger limb, the chainsaw is more controllable when the top cut is made directly above the bottom cut. So you don't always do a 3-cut method there if you're using a chainsaw. But in any case, you always want to monitor the weight of that branch because, again, you don't want it to be peeling. So the best practice currently is to cut a large diameter branch all the way back to the trunk, even though it leaves a large wound, but you do see some closure start to occur. There's some other theories on how to do a large branch, how to prune off a large branch, but that's the accepted best practice at this point. So there needs to be more research in that area. So we'll get into pruning types now. So the first pruning type I want to talk about is, and I'm going to start off with kind of the easy ones that are surely pretty simple to understand and daily activity, I suppose you could say. The first one is crown cleaning. This is especially important in mature and senescing trees in order to improve the condition and maintain the health of that tree. This is where you prune out dead branches, cracks and decays. You here in this tree, 3 defects. Number 1, you see a codominant stem, you see a dead limb, and you see a dying branch. So all of this would be pruned out and crown cleaning, take out hangers, etc. And it's also used to improve structure and also for vista pruning. Take out dying and diseased and weakly attached branches as well. All right, the next one will be crown thinning. And this is selective removal of small branches, basically reducing the crown's density, allowing wind to move through that tree a little bit better. And so you can see here in this picture how some of the smaller branches have been taken out. It just improves the structure, increases light penetration through the crown, and it really reduces the weight on the heavy limbs that help retains the tree's natural shape. Now, if this is done poorly, leaving only branches at the edge of the crown, that leaves trees vulnerable to more wind damage and causes water sprouts as well and lion tailing and things like that, which actually have a bigger negative effect than if you were to have left that in the first place. So basically, it distributes branches evenly. We next have crown raising. And this is simply where we cut off some of the lower branches, keeping in mind your branch to stem ratio. You prune out some of those lower branches to allow passage or access underneath, whether that's for lawnmowers. We do a lot of crown raising along city streets and parks and things of that nature, so for pedestrians to be able to walk through. Of course, it's also used for thinning and reducing and allowing creating better vistas as well. And that's really what we're doing a lot of the time. Besides mitigating risk is pruning for aesthetic benefits. All right, so a big one is also crown reduction, which reduces the size of the tree. It lets in more light, reduces the wind effects of the tree, reduces mechanical stresses. Reduction cuts are used in this. Heading cuts, as I mentioned before, so you cut at the nodes again. And basically, you're reducing a tree's height or spread, which is accomplished by pruning back the leaders and the branch terminals to the secondary or the lateral branches, the smaller branches that are large enough to then assume the terminal rows. And this is what I described a few slides ago. Again, at least 1/3 of the diameter of the cut stem. So you're manipulating those hormones going to the dominant top growth at that terminal bud, all right, forcing those hormones to tell the other buds to grow instead. On mature trees, reduction cuts can be somewhat stressful and can lead to more decay. They may not react as well as doing this with smaller trees. So it's best to really start out when the tree is young and create a process for this. And again, really the rule of thumb is to not prune off more than 40% for good compartmentalizers. And what the standards say is not more than 25 to 30%, which is the more typical dosage of pruning. So I just mentioned too that ideally you'd want to start pruning when the tree is young, 2 to 3 years after the planting of the tree. A lot of people complain about this idea that is primarily coming from Ed Gilman, because it's a lot of work, takes a lot of effort. You have to keep coming back regularly to that tree. However, over time, it does make a stronger tree, and there's a lot of benefits, arguable benefits that occur if you do this. And you see here this kind of timeline that happens. So this reduces or removes large aspect ratio stems and branches. It encourages formation of reaction wood, which is the strong kind of wood that creates that helps that tree to tolerate wind stress better. And it creates stem taper as well. So taper is where you would expect to see that. I'm gonna look at the camera and show you hopefully with my fingers here. It's that curving kind of shape in the stem that you want to see, where it's wider at the base of the stem than at the top, right? And so that taper is really important for creating a strong tree that doesn't get topped during windstorms. So it encourages stronger growth and structure, and it allows the crown to better absorb wind energy and not to fail. So there's a number of steps, 7 steps. I'm not really going to go through here all those steps, but in detail, there's a lot of information that you can find on structural pruning. It's a combination of a lot of the pruning we've already talked about. Always identify the objective first. What are we doing? What do we want with this tree? Then you clean out dead and dying and diseased, the triple D tree, clean out triple D branches, dead, dying, and diseased. So you clean it out first. Then you prune out crossing and rubbing branches and branches that are growing at irregular angles that will end up coming into contact with other branches that you want to remain. The 4th step is really important. This is key. You want to select the dominant leader and remove any competing leaders. And so what that means is that there might be at the top of the tree, there might be 2, I'm going to call them branches, but they're really called leaders, that are about the same size. And each one is competing to be the best, okay, dominant. And you only want one. And what you do is you look up there and you look at what you think is the best, the most straightest from the stem of the tree, or what looks the most vigorous. And that is typically the dominant leader that you select. You select lowest permanent branches where you want that. And that's what you see here with this line in the slide, the lowest permanent branches. Remember that branches stay in the same place. They don't move up the tree as the tree grows. And so your lowest permanent branches, you might flag and say, this is where I want the tree to start, or the branches to start in 15 years. Okay. And then all of these branches below are basically temporary branches. Okay. And we keep those on because as that tree grows, those branches help the tree to create that taper that I was talking about. That's so important. So we select those permanent branches that we want to stay at the same height. And then we start selecting scaffolding branches. As the term implies, scaffolding branches are these nice, strong branches of a decent size that move up the tree 18 to 24 inches apart or so, 12 to 24 inches apart sometimes. Basically, ideally at a sort of a 45-degree angle as you're moving up the tree. And so after time and after coming back, and you do this regularly because you can't cut off you can't cut off too much, right? Because that reduces that ability of that tree to photosynthesize and produce energy. So you have to be coming back. You can't do it all at once. Again, one thing I forgot to say as far as those rules of thumb for the dosage of cuts is that all depends on how often you can get back to the tree. So sometimes you have to go pretty far up, 40%. Sometimes a lot of people do more than that because they know they're not going to get back to that tree in 5 years or more. Having said that, so you select the temporary branches below these lower permanent branches that you want to remain there, just so that you're not over pruning that tree when it's so young. I talked about hitting cuts earlier. We often know this as topping. And again, this is not good for the tree. Typically not, it's really never good for the tree. Some trees can withstand topping better. Again, crepe myrtle is the most prominent one that comes to mind. But again, it's oftentimes used in some systems like pollarding. And this is basically, I just, again, want you to understand that topping is where you're cutting in the internode of the Lincoln log. And that is where, again, the internode is where that tree does not have the chemical reaction to respond in a positive way or in a healthy way to that wound that is created. Sometimes it is needed, for example, restoration from storm damage. And Dr. Gilman has a great series on storm restoration pruning that you can look up. So when do we prune? All right. So the timing is also important in addition to all these other things. Usually we want to prune during the dormant season. Why is that? That's because during the dormant season, it's less likely that we'll get pests and diseases that enter the tree with the weather the way it is, the colder temperatures. But that's not always the case. The rules are that the trees that bloom on the current season's growth, usually flowering in the summer or early fall, are pruned prior to leaf emergence in the spring, or in other words, during the dormant season. And some examples I've listed here: mimosa, sourwood, etc., camellia. And then in other cases, spring flowery trees that bloom on last season's growth should be pruned just after the bloom. These are dogwoods, crab apples, and so forth. And that's because you don't want to cut off those blooms, right? So the advantages of dormant season pruning are, again, defects are easier to see on the tree, a deciduous tree. Like I said, they minimize risk of pest problems. They can take advantage. This is the most important one probably, is the trees can then take advantage of the full growing season to start compartmentalizing those wounds and then thus invigorates growth. Okay, so the last minute or so that I have here, I just have some take home points that I really want you to walk away from this presentation with. Number one, know why you're pruning before you prune. Go back to the ANSI standards decision process, and which states what are your reasons for pruning the tree, and then what are your objectives, and all of that then is translated into the prescription. And so know why you're pruning before you prune, and then carefully consider that, write that down if needed as a plan. And I think I've seen over and over again how that kind of thinking, that kind of thought process really helps to mitigate problems down the road. Again, you want to consider climate, site, the species of the tree is very important, the biology, the branch collar, the compartmentalization of decay and so forth that I talked about, and also consider the timing of the tree. Can we get away with just pruning this tree during the dormant season where it's a little bit safer, if you will? We talked about the types, the systems and the types of pruning: cleaning, reducing, thinning, and raising. Reducing probably being one of the most common ones. And then think about the desired traits that you're looking for in those branches. U-shaped crotches. I didn't really talk about codominant stems and included bark here. Those are that a lot. For example, Bradford pear, and that's one of the reasons why they fail so often. They have a tendency to create this included bark and codominant stems. In general, a general idea, general rule of thumb is you want these U-shaped type of crotches that are stronger crotches than V-shaped or acute angles, which tend to have more likely to have that included bark. You want to have a nice single leader which encourages taper. It encourages the effort, the energy of that tree goes into that single leader instead of competing with other leaders that will again create codominant branching. And then have scaffolding branches following your selection of temporary branches. And like I said in the previous slide, make this strong structure, alternating or opposite branching, whatever the case may be. But you have larger branches that are older branches, and then that goes as it goes up the tree, you're creating this kind of ladder structure that is good for the growth of the tree, the vigor of the tree, as well as the tree's ability to deal with wind and ice and things of that. And so I guess I can answer any questions that might be out there. Here's my contact information. And again, these are some good resources that we have. Dr. Coder has arboriculture, let's just call it a pruning manual. And then Dr. Gilman has all of the different products that he's created over his career as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. This was a wonderful presentation. And opening the floor for questions. You can use the questions and answers. You can raise your hand or you can use the chat.
Yeah, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A.
I can get us started. Jason, could you talk a little bit about the importance of cambium for the tree? What is it? Where is it located? And why is it important for the tree?
Very good question. So one of the reasons we're so concerned about where we make that pruning cut, just outside of the bark ridge and the branch collar, is because they're in that defensive zone that I talked about. That's getting into the cambium of the tree. That's another reason why we're wary of peeling and why we do the straight cut method. And we don't want that limb to fall off and peel off because you start to get in the cambium. Okay. The short answer to your question is that the cambium is the living part of the tree. All right. That's where the phloem and all the different, the xylem and phloem, which are the vessels, they're like the veins, if you will, to make a metaphor, a comparison, and now comparison with humans, with animals. That's where all of the stuff happens going up and down the tree. You get into the heartwood and that's bad as well. But the cambium that's why you can see for example, in an old field, you might see a barbed wire fence that was wrapped around a tree. A few weeks ago, I saw a zip line that was wrapped around a tree. The cambium starts to grow over it. Now, in the old days, they used to harvest trees, or they used to create fields by tightly wrapping or cutting through that cambium. Again, that's the living part of the tree. Then the tree would finally die and they then push up down that tree because that was an easier way to get that tree down. So that's what's so important about the cambium is that is the living part of the tree. That's where you have nutrients and water moving from the soil up into the crown of the tree, and you have the photosynthetic products that made in the leaves moving down through the tree into the root system.
Thank you. And can you, as a follow-up to that question, you talked about compartmentalizers. Can you give some examples of good compartmentalizers and some that are not so good compartmentalizers?
Yes, maples are good, or a lot of kinds of maples are good compartmentalizers, red maple being one of them. There's a number of oaks as well. believe southern red oak. Let's see, you have another one. A bad compartmentalizer is sugarberry. What else? Southern magnolia is not a good compartmentalizer. There's one of the lists that I use frequently is there's a book by an author named Matheny, who's it's a couple of consultants, Matheny and Clark, couple of consultants out west, and also adjunct professors at California schools. And they have made a full list of good and bad compartmentalizers in addition to other characteristics of the tree by interviewing professionals across the country. So, like I said, there's some oaks that are good compartmentalizers, and there's other oaks. Black oak, I believe, is not as good of a compartmentalizer, and this is all to certain degrees as well.
We have a question. Bob Polomsky can you see it? Do you want me to read it out?
Now I can see it. Yeah.
Great.
What are your recommendations for returning a topped crepe myrtle to a natural form that protects its base shape? Is it possible? Absolutely. That's why. So you ask people, why do you top your crepe myrtle? And the common answer is that's what my daddy did, right? I always like to bring this up. So a lot of people have a lot of problems. They will say crepe myrtle's not a tree. I like crepe myrtle, um, where it's in its place. And some of the most beautiful trees I've seen are crepe myrtles in New Orleans. And they have allowed them to grow like what Bob is describing. And they're just beautiful trees, and they'll bloom 2 times a year. The great thing about crepe myrtle is that it does so well in our climate and our soils. And it's just pejorative, but I mean, they grow like a weed. And so a crepe myrtle that has been topped, you know, you stop topping it, number one, and you start to prune out. You look at the branches that you want to keep and create that. You select the branches that you want to take out and prune out to start creating that form. And again, it's going back to um, those diagrams that I had in the presentation, where you want to think about what form do you want to have. And the ones in New Orleans, for example, are the ones I'm thinking of, are grown like a tree with a stem. That's what you're going for. And some crepe myrtles do better with that than others. And then other crepe myrtles might be multi-stemmed, right? And so you just got to think about the particular shape or form that you want, stop topping it, and then start to prune out as it sprouts new branches in response to that topping. You start to prune out those sprouts, those branches that you do not want in that shape that you've selected.
Thank you. In the last minute that we have, I just want to make a comment. I love pollarding. I grew up in Bulgaria, which is in Europe. So you can imagine I grew up around pollarded trees because that's all you had in the big cities. And I, for years, have been trying to talk to people about pollarding and show them information that Ed Gilman, who is from my alma mater, by the way, and the same department where I got my master's and PhD, and all the information that he developed and the resources. So I think we can try to get this more out to people and maybe do some examples so that people can go someplace and see what pollarding is and what it can do and what species it can be used for. Because I really do believe that it is a very viable practice.
Absolutely. And that viability in Europe, all up and down the streets. And but they've been doing it for centuries. They know what they're doing when it comes to that type of heading cut. But that's why I underscored maybe twice, 2 or 3 times. You don't want to do heading cuts, particularly if you don't know what you're doing for pollarding. But pollarding is an example of where a heading cut is appropriate. But you have to keep going back and look. It takes effort. Also, the other thing I didn't talk about very quick, there's a bunch of stuff I left out, obviously, but pencil pruning with crepe myrtles is another thing, and that gets pretty close to pollarding as well. And I guess that kind of gets back to Bob's question, but it's a process. It's a prescription heading cuts without a goal, without an objective, is not a process. It's not a prescription. It's just a buzz cut, right?
That's right.
Anyway, so I'll
Thank you
stop there.
so much. If we have any questions, you can think of something through our second talk, and Jason is going to be around for the last 5 minutes. Maybe we can get your questions answered since we don't have time right now and we're getting ready to go to break. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.